All right, everybody, we're now going to talk about the idea of homeostasis and regulation. So this is the first part of chapter 32 in the textbook that we have, but it's really understanding how animals are formed and function related to maintaining a steady internal environment, which is really what homeostasis is, and the regulation that comes into play to make that happen. So the first thing to understand is that there has to be coordination and control within a given body. And there are systems in place that kind of handle those things. So we in our unit now are really going to go through and learn about what specific systems in our body do that. We've already kind of learned a little bit about what signaling types there are, but now we're getting super specific. So one example is the endocrine system. And this is chemical signals called hormones that go through our bloodstream. So there are certain endocrine glands that release hormones into the bloodstream that can then travel to other remote areas of the body somewhat far away. So this is pretty slow, but it does have long-lasting effects. And things that can receive these are specific receptors for that target hormone. In addition, we also have the nervous system. The nervous system uses neurons or brain cells to transmit information. And this is very quick because it's electric signaling, which goes a little bit faster. It doesn't have to wait for the bloodstream, and it can be really quick, instantaneous information sent from one brain cell to another or to muscles or endocrine cells to get a quick response. These are just two ways that the body can actually control itself. In thinking about organisms that can regulate and maintain homeostasis, there are two kind of major categories. One is a regulator and one is a conformer. A regulator is something that uses kind of internal mechanisms, so its own pathways inside of its body to control change, even though the outside environment might be fluctuating. So, for example, when we go outside in winter, we don't suddenly flip to the external temperature that is outside. We have internal mechanisms that are in place to help us try to maintain that happy 98.6 internal temperature. Another example of a different kind of organism is called a conformer. And this is where the internal condition actually does change with external conditions. And we'll see some kind of organisms that do that, but they don't kind of have those internal regulations that maintain a specific temperature or a specific pH level or a specific oxygen level. There's many different things that need to be regulated within the body. So the idea of homeostasis. Again, as I mentioned, it means to maintain a steady state and an internal balance, regardless of whatever outside is doing. And there's a couple of vocabulary words that go along with this. So that magical homeostasis point is called a set point. For our temperature, for example, it's 98.6. For our pH, our blood pH is about 7.4, for example. Our glucose concentration range should be about 70 to 100 milligrams. Those kinds of things. If there is a deviation from that, that acts as a stimulus. It's triggering some kind of what will be a response. It triggers some action that is detected by a sensor somewhere in your body that's just kind of waiting to be triggered if there is a fluctuation. And then as a result, when the sensor is activated in some way, there is a response. And the idea is that the response will bring you back to the set point that you are supposed to be at. So the idea or pathway that this kind of looks like, in the sense that you have a normal range, so that would be your set point. And if you deviate from that, then there's some kind of stimulus that's acting as that internal change that's detected by a sensor. And that sensor goes to whatever happens to be monitoring or the control center to then trigger, formulate, and execute some kind of response to bring you back to that normal range. Which brings about the idea of negative feedback and positive feedback. And we saw a little bit of this related to metabolic pathways in the past. So one example of negative means more gets you less. Return the changing conditions back to a set point. So let's say your body gets too warm, or your blood pH gets too high, or your blood glucose levels get too low. Whatever it is you're trying to combat or return from wherever you deviated from. So there is a negative feedback to try to bring it back to where it was. So if it's your temperature getting warmer, you're going to negatively impact that particular pathway in the hopes that then you will get cooler. Negative feedback works in the same way that we also learn about metabolic pathways, where sometimes the end product inhibits the beginning of the product when you have too much. Same thing with plants in response to water limitations. In terms of positive feedback, more gets you more. So a little bit triggers kind of that, let's roll with this, make more and more and more as much as we can. It kind of acts as an amplifier. So this will get you farther and farther away from the set point that you normally have. So in animals, an example would be lactation. So normally your set point is none, but obviously when you have a child, the idea is that the initial lactation that a mammal has will trigger more and more and more and more. Same thing with onset of labor. Once you get that ball rolling, then it is kind of a positive feedback loop until it is done. In plants, it's ripening. So once a fruit starts to ripen, it's and some of those chemicals are produced, it's a positive feedback loop that just triggers the quicker ripening of the rest of the fruit. Oftentimes, homeostasis and positive and negative feedback is related in the sense of a thermostat that's monitoring the temperature in your house. So let's say we have a room temperature set to about 20. If for some reason the temperature increases, then that is the stimulus that triggers the sensor, which is the thermostat, to turn off. And that would be the response. And then the room temperature should therefore decrease. Now, on the flip side, if the room temperature decreases, that would be the stimulus that tells the sensor to turn on. And then the response would then be the temperature back increasing till it gets back up to 20 degrees. And it just kind of oscillates between those two things. Both halves of this are considered negative feedback because you're trying to really get back to that set point. All right. So I've used temperature a lot in the examples of homeostasis, and we just talked about a thermostat that's regulating temperature. So let's go ahead and take a peek at what that looks like in more detail. Organisms, in this case, can either be endothermic or ectothermic. And this goes along with regulators and conformers. So endothermic, you need to generate heat. We talked about endothermic reactions, right, in the past. So those would be ones that you need to put energy in. Same thing here. The animals essentially need to put energy in themselves. They are generating heat by metabolism. So the act of breaking down your food generates a little bit of heat, and that helps us maintain our normal temperature. This is what a regulator would do. On the flip side, ectothermic means that you actually gain heat from outside sources. So these are what really the conformers fit into. They don't have internal mechanisms that will generate heat. So they have to get it from the sun or from heat rocks, for example. These include things like invertebrates, fish, amphibians, and such. So question, which is more active at greater temperature variations? The answer, endothermic. So because conformers are really a function of whatever temperature environment they're in, they can often stop moving at certain temperatures and other external sources in terms of stimulus. But endotherms, because we're trying to maintain our, say, internal temperature or homeostasis, we're able to remain active at various temperatures. Which one requires more energy? Definitely endotherms. So it does require a lot more energy put in for us to maintain the internal temperatures that we have. All right, so here are some examples. A walrus is an endotherm. It tries to maintain a steady internal temperature regardless of whatever environment it's in, which is probably why it has such thick blubber to help insulate it. Whereas on the bottom, there's a lizard, it's an ectotherm. Its temperature is a function of whatever environment it's in. Oftentimes, that's why lizards like to hang out on rocks from the sun, because those rocks have been able to absorb the heat of the sun and are therefore warm. And that's why if you ever own a lizard, oftentimes they have heat lamps as well. Here's an example of a graph that kind of shows you overall temperature and then the body temperature of the organism. So for an otter, regardless of whatever the ambient or environmental temperature is, it has a steady state of roughly what we are. In terms of us, our body temperature is 37 degrees Celsius, so that's pretty on par with an otter. Whereas a largemouth bass, it's totally a function of whatever it is in the environment. So in terms of energy use, metabolic rate. We learned what metabolism was previously, but metabolic rate is the total amount of energy an animal is using per unit time. So it's kind of a function of how much metabolism is happening per unit time. Ectotherms have a much lower metabolic rate than endotherms of comparable size, and I'll show you some graphs in a minute. But what that's really saying is that ectotherms, because they don't have to regulate their internal temperature, are really much lower in terms of energy usage per unit time, compared to an endotherm of the same size that would have to expend more energy over a unit time in order to maintain that internal temperature. Long story short, it's much more energy cost related to being an endotherm than an ectotherm. And this graph, or these graphs, really show that. So the one on the left is just showing you kind of the body mass of an organism and its overall metabolism. In this case, basic metabolic rate. But then when you put it on a log scale on the right, it really highlights that point. In this case, it's kind of showing you that per unit size, so actually looking at it per kilogram, you can see that over time it's this, but over here, the shrew, for its small size, actually has the highest metabolic rate per size compared to the larger organisms, which have the lowest metabolic rate per kilogram. So the larger the organism is, the higher it has to have in terms of a basic metabolic rate over unit time. But for specifically looking at size, the smaller organisms have a faster metabolic rate. So that's kind of gives you a clue as to why small mammals like mice and shrews, even cats and dogs, have really, really fast heartbeats because their metabolism is going so quickly compared to an elephant that doesn't need to have one so quickly. Okay, so organisms in and of itself exchange heat by 4 physical processes. And they're shown here in this picture. But radiation is when when light waves bounce off of some kind of organism or really any surface. And the idea is the thing that the photons are hitting initially is able to absorb some of that energy, and then a small amount of it is going to kind of bounce off and leave. But in this case, the lizard is actually able to absorb some of the heat energy. And that's why we get warmer when we lay in the sun. Another one is evaporation. In this case, the evaporation of water from kind of the moisture-rich surfaces of the lizard, so maybe its mouth or its nose, will evaporate off of the lizard. And any kind of evaporation that's happening actually causes things to cool. So for example, when we sweat as humans and that sweat evaporates off of our skin, it makes us cooler. Convection has to do with the movement of air or a liquid past a surface. It doesn't have to necessarily do with direct connection. It could be a breeze. So when there's a breeze blowing by us, it can often have a cooling effect because it's blowing across the surface. And conduction really does have to do with contact. So it's the direct transfer of heat. In this case, if the lizard sits on a hot rock that's been sitting in the sun, it's able to absorb some of the heat that rock provided. So in some of these instances, heat is going to be absorbed or heat is going to be emitted. And collectively, it will hopefully yield a constant internal environment. All right. So things that organisms do to try to maintain their homeostasis in terms of temperature: insulation. So skin, feathers, fur, blubber, like in our whale or our walrus that we had before. Circulatory adaptations, which I'll explain in a minute. But birds use something called countercurrent exchange, which is kind of cool actually, to maintain their core temperature. Evaporative loss, so that's us, we sweat. We also shiver, so if we're really cold, we start physically shaking, and when our muscles are moving, we can generate heat that way, or teeth chattering, those kinds of things. We also have cellular things that we can do. So our bodies have adapted or evolved certain antifreeze proteins that are in certain organisms, or change their membrane structures. Remember, there are certain concentrations of things like lipids in the membrane that can affect fluidity, and different enzymes that might work well in certain situations. This picture is showing you the concurrent heat exchange. So in a bird, it's really cool. The idea is they're trying to keep the warm air in the center of the bird. And so when blood, which, is normally warm, especially since it's by the, heart and really core of the body, whenever it is pumped down into the legs of this bird, the arteries are very closely laid to the veins, and heat naturally goes from wherever it's warm to wherever it's not warm. Think of it like diffusion, even though it's not really diffusion. So thermal temperatures will always go from wherever it's warm to wherever it's colder. So as the blood is going down to the foot of the duck or bird or whatever it may be, the heat actually gets pulled from the artery side that's going away from the core to the vein side that's going back up to the core. So in essence, it kind of creates a heat differential between the core is really warm and the heat gets to switch over to the vein and go back to the core before it really has a chance to cool down all the way. And then you end up with the foot of the duck being pretty cold, but yet blood is still circulating. So it doesn't hurt the bird to have this process. It just means that their feet happen to be colder than their core. Similar to, other adaptations, birds and mammals can vary their insulation to acclimate to certain temperature changes. Ectotherms, it's a problem because it must really be at a cellular level. They can't necessarily change the fact that they have to conform to whatever the environment is. So that's more on the cellular level with antifreeze compounds that might be formed within the cellular level versus just having thicker insulation. And then this last slide here is showing you roughly what that thermostat example looked like, except actually thinking about how it might work in a normal body setting. So as your temperature increases, so let's say you're outside on a hot day, then the thermostat, in this case, it's your hypothalamus that's registering this information. That's the sensor. Will then trigger the responsive cooling mechanism. Will trigger, so it's activating the response of cooling. So it will cause the blood vessels in the skin to dilate, and when they dilate, then it increases the exchange surface of heat to then leave the body. That's oftentimes why you can see the blood vessels in your arms a lot more when you're, have been working out and you're warm. We also sweat, so we trigger sweat because the evaporation of that sweat will cool us down, and inevitably then we will decrease our temperature back to normal. And then, like now when it's cold winter outside or almost winter, we have our body temperature decreases. So then we have warming mechanisms. So our blood vessels will either dilate to try to trap in as much heat as we can and lose less. And we also shiver because our muscles will generate heat when they are shaking, and that will warm us up. And then hopefully our temperature will then increase and we will get back to normal. So these are just some of the specific examples in which feedback plays a role in us maintaining homeostasis. And you might see some of these examples to maintain appropriate cellular signaling.